6:47 in the morning, a 34-year-old hiker named Derek Voss posted a photo to his hiking group page, a trailhead sign, golden morning light, a single water bottle clipped to his pack. The caption read, "Easy 10-mile loop today. No water needed. It's only spring." This is the story of what happens in the 6 hours in between, and why "it's only spring" is one of the most dangerous sentences a hiker can say out loud in the Superstition Mountains. The Superstition Mountains rise abruptly out of the desert floor east of Phoenix, Arizona, a jagged, dramatic range that looks from a distance almost like a movie set. They are popular for exactly that reason, close enough to a major city for a day trip, striking enough to feel like a real wilderness adventure, and steeped in legend, most famously the story of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine, a tale of hidden treasure that has drawn treasure hunters and hikers into these canyons for more than a century. The range has one of the highest search and rescue call volumes of any hiking area in Arizona. The terrain is deceptive. Trails that look well marked on a map often fade into faint use trails on the ground. Canyons twist and split in ways that are easy to misjudge, and the desert offers almost no shade for the majority of most routes. Cell service is patchy at best throughout much of the range, and the thing that catches the most people off guard year after year is the heat, because in central Arizona, spring does not mean what it means almost everywhere else in the country. By late April, daytime temperatures in the superstitions regularly climb into the mid-90s. By the time May arrives, 100-degree days are common. There is no gradual transition into summer here. The desert goes from pleasant to dangerous in a matter of weeks, and a trail that felt comfortable in March can be a heat emergency by the following month. Derek Voss had been hiking for about 2 years. He was fit. He ran 3 times a week, did strength training at a gym near his apartment in Tempe, and had completed a handful of respectable day hikes across Arizona: Camelback Mountain, Pinnacle Peak, a rim-to-rim attempt at the Grand Canyon that he'd had to turn back on the year before due to a knee issue. He wasn't reckless by nature. His hiking group knew him as someone who did research before a trip. He read trail reports, checked recent trip logs, looked at elevation profiles. In many ways, he did more preparation than the average casual hiker, but he had a specific blind spot, and it's one that shows up again and again in incident reports from the Southwest. He had built his sense of how much water I need almost entirely from hikes he'd done in cooler months, in cooler regions, or on trails with more tree cover. He had never done a long desert hike in genuinely hot, exposed conditions. His internal calibration for how much water is enough had never actually been tested against the environment he was about to enter. He'd chosen a loop in the superstitions that he'd found mentioned in a hiking app, roughly 10 miles, moderate elevation gain, no technical sections. On paper, well within his ability. He'd done longer hikes. He'd done hikes with more elevation gain. This one looked, by his own established standards, easy. Derek arrived at the trailhead a little before sunrise, parking in a mostly empty lot. It was a Tuesday, fewer hikers than a weekend, which he liked. He preferred hiking alone. It let him move at his own pace, stop when he wanted, and he'd done enough solo hikes by this point that it didn't register as a risk factor in his mind. It was just how he liked to hike. He carried a 20-liter day pack. Inside, a single 1-liter water bottle, a couple of energy bars, a light rain shell he never really needed in Arizona, but carried out of habit, a phone, and a small first aid kit. He wore a baseball cap, not a wide-brimmed sun hat. He'd applied sunscreen, but hadn't packed extra. 1 liter of water for a 10-mile hike in late April in the desert. This is worth sitting with because it is the single most consequential decision of the entire day, made before he'd taken a single step on the trail. The National Park Service and desert hiking guides across the Southwest are remarkably consistent on this figure. In hot, exposed desert conditions, a hiker should carry roughly 1 liter of water per hour of activity, and often more. A 10-mile hike with meaningful elevation gain, even at a brisk pace, was realistically a 4 to 6 hour undertaking. By that standard, Derek was carrying somewhere between a sixth and a quarter of what the terrain and conditions actually demanded. He posted his photo at the trailhead sign, cheerful, confident, the golden early light making the mountains behind him look inviting rather than threatening. Easy 10-mile loop today. No water needed. It's only spring. Then he started walking. The first 2 hours were, by any measure, a good hike. The temperature at the trailhead when he started was somewhere in the low 70s, comfortable, even pleasant. The trail climbed gradually through a wash lined with palo verde and saguaro, the kind of classic Sonoran desert scenery that makes this range so popular with photographers and casual hikers alike. Derek moved at a strong pace. He felt good. He stopped periodically to take photos, drank from his bottle when he was thirsty, and by his own instinct-based rationing, felt like he was managing his water just fine. By the time he reached the 2-mile mark, his single-liter bottle was already empty. This is a critical, almost invisible moment in stories like this one, because nothing dramatic happened at mile 2. There was no crisis. He simply finished his water the way anyone does on a hike, steadily, without really tracking the pace of his own consumption against the distance still ahead of him. He'd assumed, without ever explicitly working out the math, that one bottle would get him through a comfortable portion of the hike, with maybe a stream crossing or a spring somewhere along the route where he could refill. There was no spring. This was the Superstition Mountains in a dry spring following a low snowpack winter. Most of the seasonal water sources that might exist after a wet winter were already dry. At mile 2, with an empty bottle and 8 miles still ahead of him, Derek kept walking. This is the part of the day where the desert's defining characteristic came into play, the temperature curve. Unlike many environments where morning heat builds gradually and predictably, the desert in spring can shift quickly once the sun climbs high enough to eliminate the last of the morning shade. Between 9 and 11 in the morning, the ambient temperature climbed from the comfortable low 70s into the high 80s. By 11, exposed sections of trail, and in the Superstitions, most sections are exposed, were baking in direct, unfiltered sunlight. Derek was now hiking without water, in rising heat, on a trail that offered essentially no shade, roughly 3 to 4 miles from his car by the most direct route back, but committed to a loop that would take him further before it brought him back around. This is the decision point that stories like this one always circle back to, the choice to keep going forward on a loop rather than backtracking the way he'd come. A loop trail, by its nature, removes the simplest safety option, turning around and retracing known ground, and replaces it with a commitment to complete unknown terrain ahead in order to get back to the start. Derek had done the math on this loosely in his head days earlier when planning the hike from the comfort of his apartment. The loop was more interesting, covered more varied terrain, and the elevation profile suggested it wasn't dramatically harder than backtracking would be. What that planning hadn't accounted for was what a body does without water, in rising heat, several miles from any water source, several more miles still to go. He began to feel the first easy-to-dismiss signs, a mild headache, slightly less energy on the climbs, a dry mouth that he registered but didn't yet treat as urgent because he still had, by his own assessment, plenty of hiking left in him. By this point in the hike, well before anything visibly alarming was happening, Derek's body had already begun a cascade that would define the rest of his day. Sweat is the body's primary cooling mechanism. Evaporating moisture off the skin pulls heat away from the body's core, but sweating requires water, and water that isn't being replaced is water the body is spending down from an account with no more deposits coming in. As Derek continued hiking without replacing fluids, his blood volume was gradually decreasing. Plasma is largely water, and as dehydration progresses, there is simply less fluid volume in the bloodstream. Derek's headache, his fatigue, his dry mouth, these were early signals of exactly this process beginning. Mild dehydration was tipping toward moderate, and he was still walking uphill, in direct sun with no water and several miles still ahead of him. By 11:30, Derek had reached roughly the far point of the loop, the section of trail farthest from the trailhead in both directions. This is the geometry that makes loop hikes specifically dangerous in an emergency. At this point, continuing forward and turning back were now roughly the same distance. There was no longer a clearly shorter option in either direction. He was tired in a way that felt different from ordinary hiking fatigue, heavier, duller, harder to push through with willpower alone. He'd stopped sweating as visibly as he had earlier in the hike, though at the time this didn't register to him as a warning sign. In fact, this is one of the more dangerous and counterintuitive signs of advancing heat illness. As the body's cooling system begins to fail, sweating can actually decrease, which can feel to someone without medical training like the exertion is becoming easier rather than more dangerous. He checked his phone, one bar of signal flickering. He considered briefly sending a message to someone, a friend, his hiking group, but decided against it. He didn't want to seem like he was overreacting over what still felt, in his own assessment, like ordinary hiking discomfort. This is a pattern worth naming directly. The reluctance to call for help while still capable of walking is one of the most common threads in solo hiking emergencies, because asking for help while still mobile requires acknowledging a level of danger that, in the moment, doesn't yet feel justified. He kept walking. Between noon and 1 p.m., the temperature at trail level in the exposed sections of the Superstitions had climbed into the mid-90s, hot but not exceptional for the range in late spring, which is precisely what makes conditions like these so dangerous. This wasn't an unusual heat wave. This was an ordinary hot day, and it was enough. Derek's condition moved from the early warning signs of dehydration into clear heat exhaustion. His skin, still able to sweat at this stage but less effectively, felt clammy rather than dry. He felt nauseated. His pace had slowed dramatically. What should have been a strong hiking cadence had become a shuffle with frequent stops. His thinking had started to narrow, focusing almost entirely on the immediate discomfort rather than the broader situation he was in. He sat down on a rock in a small patch of partial shade beside a tall saguaro, intending to rest for a few minutes. He drank the last few drops that remained in his bottle from earlier, nowhere near enough to matter at this stage, and closed his eyes. He did not clearly recall the next hour. At some point after 1 p.m., Derek's condition crossed from heat exhaustion into heat stroke, the point at which the body's temperature regulation fails outright. His core temperature, no longer being effectively managed by a sweating mechanism that had largely shut down, continued climbing, even though he was now sitting still rather than exerting himself further. Heat stroke brings with it altered mental status, confusion, disorientation, and in more severe cases, loss of consciousness. Derek slipped from confused, foggy awareness into unconsciousness roughly 4 miles from the trailhead, on a section of trail with intermittent cell coverage at best, alone. He had told no one his specific route. His hiking group knew from his morning post that he was doing an easy 10-mile loop somewhere in the Superstitions, a description that, to anyone trying to locate him later, offered almost no useful specificity about which trailhead, which direction, or which of the range's many interlocking loop options he had actually chosen. Later that afternoon, another hiker heading in the opposite direction on the same loop came across Derek slumped against the saguaro, unresponsive. Search and rescue, coordinated through the county sheriff's office, reached the location roughly 40 minutes later, a response time that in the Superstition Mountains' rugged and often GPS unreliable terrain was considered fast. A helicopter was used for extraction, given the distance from any accessible road. Derek was airlifted to a hospital in Phoenix, where he was treated for severe heat stroke, including active cooling measures and IV fluids to address profound dehydration. Derek survived. He spent 2 days in the hospital, part of that time in intensive care, while doctors monitored him for the kidney and liver complications that can follow severe heat stroke, organs that can sustain lasting damage from the combination of extreme core temperature and profound dehydration, even after a patient is successfully cooled and stabilized. The Superstition Mountains and desert ranges like them across the Southwest don't operate on the same seasonal assumptions that shape most people's intuitions about safe hiking weather. Spring in the low desert is not a mild transitional season. By April, and certainly by May, it can produce exactly the kind of heat that kills unprepared hikers every single year, without a single day of what most people would call extreme heat on the calendar.